ARENA acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia. We pay our respects to elders past and present and recognise that Australia's path to net zero runs through First Nations lands. ARENA envisions a future where clean energy strengthens connection to country and First Nations communities thrive as owners, partners, and proud custodians of the clean energy transition. Welcome to ReWired, the podcast spotlighting the Australians turning big clean energy ideas into real-world impact. From ambition to action, these are the people rewiring our future.
Wonderful to meet you, Tanya.
Thank
you for being part of our Aussies in the Arena conversations, trying to understand all the great work that Arena does to decarbonise Australia's economy and champion climate solutions in the world that our listeners are so interested in. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Name, rank, serial number.
Name, rank, serial number. Well, I'll start with my name. My name's Tanya Hodgson. I'm very happy to be a part of the Aussies at Arena, but I'm a pseudo-Aussie with South African roots. So I moved here quite a few years ago now, although it was meant to be a 2-year sojourn that is much extended at this point. I'm the investment lead in Arena's heavy industry portfolio. So I usually like to introduce myself by saying, technically I'm a chemical engineer, but I probably wouldn't hire myself as a chemical engineer at this point.
Right. And you got into innovation investment through Arena, or had a prior career in this space?
A bit of a journey. So my background, I worked at Bain & Company for nearly 7 years. I did quite a long stint in their private equity ring fence. So I'd done a lot of work, due diligencing big billion-dollar deals at Bain. And I was always kind of looking for a space that I could wake up and feel like I was doing something impactful. And renewable energy was a nice crossover where I could kind of tie in my engineering background with something that I was interested in, wanted to do, and felt like was a direction that I wanted to see the world move in. It just so happened that I had the opportunity while I was at Bain to do sort of a year secondment at a solar energy startup. So I worked in solar. So that was my kind of foot in the door to renewables. And actually that's how I first engaged with Arena, because I worked on an Arena grant while I was at the solar startup. And then Arena liked to joke that they still paid a recruiter to hire me because it wasn't that entry point that I was hired with. But then the opportunity with Arena was just opportune, and I could kind of blend some technical depth with a fairly strong investment style background, even though I hadn't specifically applied that in renewable energy technology.
One more background question before we get to the Arena career. What was the solar startup, just out of interest?
So I actually worked at 5B, which maybe Dan spoke about on the previous podcast.
We have talked a bit about 5B and we'll come back to it probably, because one of the inputs into your industrial decarbonisation agenda surely must be low-cost solar power in Australian context, and 5B may be a part of that, yeah?
Yeah, potentially. It's so 100% you need low-cost renewables. I mean, that's a major unlock, generally decarbonising all of industry, but particularly heavy industry, because they have such massive load profiles. They use a lot of energy. So you definitely need low-cost renewables to do that. I don't specifically work on that side, but it's part of the recipe, 100%.
So before we dive into the why Arena does industrial decarb and the industrial transformation strategy we'll dive into, we like to get you to just hark back to your favorite moment, the big, fantastic memory you have of the tenure you've had at Arena so far, kind of a cool thing, and you went, wow, I'm doing this.
I don't think I have one cool thing, so maybe I'll give you a couple of cool things.
Great.
I think overall, it makes a difference, like to wake up, read the news, feel like you're interested in the space, feel like you're making some kind of small progress. So I think that overall means a lot to me, makes a difference. I had a couple of cool moments, got out to the Pilbara last year, I think maybe the year before now, and got to see, the massive 240-ton autonomous mining haul trucks there. And, I learned about those when we did risk in engineering. So to get to see those in person and understand how big a challenge it is to decarbonize those from running on diesel to, being electric fuel trucks was really cool. And the fact that they're driving around the Pilbara with with no one in them.
Big,
was pretty
remote
neat.
control, like radio controlled cars we used to have as
100%.
kids, but in the desert.
But massive. And then you've got the control room, somebody sitting there with like 8 screens around them operating this fleet of mining haul trucks. So that was pretty cool. Have got to do quite a number of speaking gigs, which has been great. So it was a memorable but maybe odd moment sitting at the IGCC. It's like the investor summit in Sydney last year, talking about green steel and kind of thinking, how did I get here? But this is cool.
I'm in the big end of town telling them all what they need to do. That's great. That's an important part of the agency's role, I guess, to help the people with the capital deploy it in the future sense that we need.
Yeah, exactly. Like drawing investment to where you need it most and bringing awareness to the problems that we're tackling.
All right, so let's talk about decarbonising Australia's industry. I didn't think Australia was a big industrial country.
Yeah.
How big is it, and what's the carbon footprint of that?
It's actually a really good question. And I think it's because the term industry is so broad. Like it's hard to say, okay, cool, what exactly does industry mean? So maybe a good way to break it down is if you think of anything that's like a factory or a plant, like a process plant, that is loosely defined as industry. So you've got your retail consumer goods, like your Coles and your Woolworths, etc. That's not what we'd think about as industry, but you would think about the companies that are making those products, packaging them, etc. So your food and beverage sector, so like your McCain potato factory, that's industry, or your wineries, like you would think about that in the food and beverage. And that's probably on like the smaller end of town. And then you've got probably the things that come quicker to mind. Australia's massive mining country, right? Number 1 supplier of iron ore globally. So we got a ton of mining, which I would still kind of think about that in that loose industry term. We have steel mills. We actually have a huge amount of alumina refining. So Australia is also the world's largest supplier of alumina. So we have 5 operating alumina refineries today.
And that's a mid-step between dirt and cans.
Exactly. So you get the bauxite ore out the ground. So that's your dirt or your ore. You turn that ore into alumina, and that's the step that we do in Australia. And then you turn that alumina into aluminium, which is what you make your cans out of.
And in most of the other hard rock mining things we do in Australia, like iron ore, like cobalt, like lithium, we don't do that mid-step. We just ship dirt or rocks, sometimes small rocks made from bigger rocks, but that's about as much processing as we do, and then get someone else to do the value adding offshore.
100%. So Australia's known branding is that we are the dig and ship country. We're really good at digging and shipping product out the ground. And I mean, iron ore is a fundamental part of Australia's economy with other mining products as well. And so we're trying to think strategically about which parts of those next steps, those midstream like refining, processing steps, make sense for Australia to do onshore. And it's definitely not all of it. We can't compete on cost with other countries where you can do that really cheaply, but it does make sense to do some of it. And, alumina refining is a good example. Like we do that midstream processing here.
So we'll come back to the industrial strategy of it, and we'll also come back to a bit of wine. I'll have a wine in a moment. But just to go back to the decarbonisation question, why should we worry about what we already do, whether it's food processing or minerals shipping, digging and shipping, in climate terms?
Really, the long and the short of it is emissions. So industry overall accounts for 44%. That's probably an old stat. It's probably a little bit higher today, of Australia's total emissions.
Wow. More than power sector, more than transport.
As a whole sector, yes. The complexity is that part of those emissions might come from power,
logistics,
right?
For example.
So some of it comes from the things that you do on site, on the ground, like your process heat, your trucks, whatever the case might be. And some of it comes from your electricity. But then you also use nearly half of Australia's energy in industry. So it's a massive energy sink. It's a massive carbon emissions emitting sector. So if we want to transition to a green energy future, like, you have to solve this.
Okay.
And the load profiles, so like the amount of energy, the amount of emissions that individual facilities use is huge. Like, it's useful actually to put it in perspective. So one aluminium smelter, so we turn the alumina into the aluminium, I think if I get the stat right, it's equivalent to something like 10 million passenger cars a year in terms of emissions.
This is why they say aluminium is congealed electricity.
Well, yeah, exactly.
Wow.
Lots and lots of electricity. Melting metal is very energy intensive.
Huh. Okay, so take home for me and for our listeners so far is Australia's actually got a lot of industry.
Yep.
And has a big footprint and power consumption profile, therefore emissions, but we're solving it. We've got a whole program at ARENA, the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, to innovate around those supply chains and decarbonise. How do you think about that problem? It sounds vast. I mean, what do you prioritise?
It is vast. It is broad. And I would say this portfolio particularly, we're dealing with a lot of different supply chains. You know, you can think about the iron ore supply chain, which has everything from your mining trucks moving the ore to your steel makers who are making iron and then making steel, your whole aluminium supply chain. We're newly getting into critical energy minerals as well. So that's all your mineral products that you use for renewable energy. So like your lithium, your copper,
silicon for solar
panels, all of that kind of stuff. And each of those have their own supply chain as well. So how do we prioritize it? We anchor on themes. So we have investment priorities. They are, iron and steel, alumina, critical energy minerals. And then we do have a bigger bucket of funds that's more general industrial decarbonisation. Things like, heat recovery, electrification at smaller facilities. So we think about what the fit is with those investment priorities. But then a lot comes down to what is the investment thesis, for that project? Like, does this project really make sense? So how much impact is it going to have? Like, what's the emissions reduction opportunity? What's the energy intensity opportunity? And then you're starting to just tick the boxes of your, I guess, typical diligence. Like, is this a good project? Are these capable partners? Do we believe in the tech? Is there a path to this solution being cost competitive one day? Because while we do play in innovation, and we know that when you're early on, technology is more expensive. Like, we've seen that time and time again. Solar was way more expensive than it is now 20 years ago. But you have to believe there's some kind of pathway to being competitive. And is it replicable is also a good question. So we try not to fund something that is just a niche application, maybe at one site with one specific solution. So I'll generally be thinking about, okay, if I do this project with these guys here, where else can it be done?
The five alumina smelters could follow the first.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And then ideally, you don't have to fund every one of those because somebody's already tested it. You get the data out, you get the economics out, and that lowers the barrier to the next one doing it.
And so at the top of that decision tree, just to be clear, the theses that you pick, is that somewhat based on like Australia's GDP? Like, iron ore to steel is X percent of Australia's foreign exchange earnings. Alumina is another big chunk. Other industries, wine, maybe a really big piece, even though it's small by volume, it's a big by value. Do we think in those terms as well?
It is an element, yes. So like that is a part of it. We're basically securing these sectors, the relevance, and the longevity of these sectors as the whole world transitions to renewable power, right? So that is a part of the story. I would say probably at the top of our, decision tree, we think about emissions. So what's the total impact in terms of emissions? What's the energy intensity profile? How big is that market? And then when you're thinking about how big the market is, that might come into number of players, it might come into GDP, and that all gets you down to how big a problem is this for Australia? And is this a problem that the market can't solve on their own, right? Which is why ARENA doesn't really play in commercial technology anymore. Large scale wind and solar, you know, my husband works in utility scale wind development. ARENA doesn't do that anymore. We do the stuff that's not there yet.
Great. Good. Got it. So what's exciting then? What technologies are coming up in the decarbonisation of steel and wine?
Yeah.
Whatever you like.
Whatever I like. A lot of it is innovation in process engineering, which is maybe a little bit niche, but I'll
geek out. Come on, give it to us.
I'll simplify it a bit. So I'd say there's two themes of problems that we're solving, right? So one is that a bunch of these facilities use a ton of heat. Like a lot of their energy demand or energy intensity is in the form of heat. You know, so you think of your smelter, you got to melt your alumina, right? And that's similar in steel. So like to make iron, that step is very high heat, and you need that heat to initiate the chemical reaction that turns your iron ore into iron. So I think there's a couple of things. I would say overall, we're seeing a lot of momentum in thermal energy storage, which is pretty exciting. And maybe the best way to think about that is like a heat battery. If you have this heat battery, which can often look kind of basic, like it can be like a mortar brick.
Rocks in box.
Like, pretty much, right? Yeah. That lets an industrial facility with a really big energy load to basically use and store that energy when it's really cheap, and then dispel it when they need it, right? That's important because all of these facilities, it's really critical that you have constant, reliable electricity. And that's a barrier to transitioning to renewables, which are intermittent, because the battery case, like your generic battery, doesn't really make sense. It's too big, it's too expensive, etc. So yeah, these heat batteries is kind of exciting.
Okay, so just to go back a bit on that one, we need heat to do things like metal making and wine making or milk making, you know, pasteurization.
To varying degrees. Yeah.
Yeah. What are the temperature ranges of the heat we have to get to? Just because you said really high heat, but a lot of these things aren't that.
A lot of them aren't. Yeah. So we'd kind of think about it in two ways. So you've got a lot of low temperature process heat, and that's in your wineries, in your dairy farm. I mean, it's not in the farm, but in the dairy factory, I guess you'd say. And that is much lower. It can be like 40 degrees, 60 degrees, 80 degrees. So that's what we kind of call lower temperature heat. But then when you're thinking about aluminum smelting, you know, or your iron ore step, you're way up there, like above 800 degrees. And so the technical requirements of those two different solutions are pretty significant.
And so these thermal batteries were effectively zapping rocks or some material, something with electricity from solar and wind, which is, you know, knowable but variable to some degree, so that they store heat in that form and then release it for the industrial process at the right temperature range.
At the right temperature range,
as needed on demand. Name some companies or paint a picture. Show us what that looks like. I'm going to
give a shout out to some companies.
Eye,
Off the top of my head, Rondo's doing some cool things, particularly in Europe, in high temperature heat batteries. So yeah, I mean, I think that will be interesting to see. There's a few other players in the space. ARENA recently funded MGA Thermal. So all kind of doing similar type of things, but different temperature ranges, different applications.
They're out of the Hunter or something.
I think so. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so we've got heat batteries, which is great. What other processes are you excited about? You mentioned you're a chemical engineer, so geek out for a minute on these things.
Okay, cool. Let me talk about green steel. So today we make steel pretty much all over the world by putting all your iron ore in what we call a blast furnace, which is a massive furnace. And when you heat that up and you have coal inside it, you enable a chemical process that turns iron ore into iron. And then later you make the iron into steel. And so because you use coal or coking coal, it's super emissions intensive. So there's a couple of different ways to do that instead of using coking coal. And they're kind of taking traction at varying rates across the world. So you can use hydrogen instead of coal as call it the reductant, but it's basically the means to enable that chemical reaction from iron ore to iron. So that's one way. You can also do this with electricity. So electrochemical technologies is gaining a bit more traction generally, not just in iron, but in some other areas as well. And so that's pretty exciting to basically see if that works. And you're essentially putting your iron ore in a chemical solution, like running a electricity current through it. And that process causes the iron to deposit out of the solution into an iron product. It causes the iron ore.
Is this what we call electric arc furnaces?
No.
Oh, okay.
So this is what you'd call electrolysis or electrochemical iron making, and that will turn your iron ore into iron. So then an electric arc furnace is the second step. That's what you can use. It's one of the ways to turn iron into steel. And it's basically a very hot furnace. You add some other things to then create your steel product.
So this is electric everything. And do we have that first step of iron ore to iron through this electrolysis in Australia yet? Or are you trying to find some pilots?
So we're definitely interested in it. It's super early. So today I'd probably say, especially in Australia, we'd probably term it like on your lab bench, right? So that's the scale, think a skid or like a 2 meter squared kind of setup. Boston Metals is probably one of the bigger companies that are doing it globally, but they do very, very high heat electrolysis. And then a company that's actually recently picked up a lot of momentum is Electra. They're also overseas in the US. They've raised a lot of money recently, but they're still testing it. So pretty big facility, but it's still at like the testing phase. Does it work? How much does it cost?
And then how about the hydrogen route to market for iron ore?
That is more progressed, I would say. So especially overseas, particularly in Europe, I'd say that like first movers in green iron and steel. So you are seeing big like commercial, 1 million ton per annum plants being built. Like Stegra is a good example, or H2 Green Steel, I think, rebranding.
That's what Bao Steel in China are doing.
Yeah, so Bao in China is also doing DRI with hydrogen. It's just going to come kind of gradually. So a lot of these players are starting off by using both natural gas and hydrogen. So it's a blend. And then you sort of see if it works. A lot of it is about the cost of hydrogen, right? So technically we believe it works, but it's too expensive. So as hydrogen becomes cheaper, then this becomes more doable.
And this comes back to our conversation about renewable superpower and low-cost electricity inputs to make hydrogen, in this case, at very low cost.
Yep.
But before we go to that, do we have examples of companies in Australia sort of collaborating to make that happen sooner?
Yeah,
fast forward.
Good question. We actually have a pretty cool project. We funded the engineering work of what is called the NeoSmelt project, which is exactly that. It's a consortium of your major players in mining and steel making. So it's got the likes of BlueScope, BHP, Rio Tinto, Mitsui, Woodside. I think I haven't left anybody out. And they are all very invested in basically making sure that you can use the ore that comes out of Australia, like the Pilbara, which is all the ore that we export, 95% of it. You can use that ore in green steel processes because the requirements and the implications are a bit different to how we make steel today, right? So all of those big players working together is pretty unprecedented, I would say.
Yeah.
I mean, it's great from our perspective because it means that you don't need to do the same work 5 times, for 5 times the price.
And is ARENA in the middle of that conversation?
So we've been kind of on the journey with them. So we supported, which is now public, you can go check it out on the ARENA website. We've supported the design work for this plant that they want to build. I mean, it's a demonstration plant. So that's all the prep. It's like, the technical design, the economic validation, site approvals, blah, 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 all of that kind of stuff that then enables that consortium of companies to say, okay, are we going to invest in doing this at X scale?
Amazing. Good work. Well done.
Yeah.
Getting that
So it'll be
rolling.
interesting to see how that turns out and what ends up happening.
Good for our listeners to know about that. But I know what they really want to know about is wine.
Is wine.
Yes. So talk to me about Arena's investment in that industry.
We're pretty excited about it. We can't wait for a site visit. It's not my deal specifically, so I'll do what I can.
Tag along if you
I'll
can.
see if I can tag along, right? Where this kind of came about is Arena has a bucket of funds called the Industrial Transformation Stream, which is a $400 million program, which is, I would say, like in addition to the investment priorities that we set in-house. It aligns, which is why we're delivering it, but it's a specific fund, and that's designed to decarbonize existing regional industrial facilities in Australia. And so this project, this winery project, kind of came about through that fund, and they're doing some pretty interesting work to decarbonize their energy use at their facility in the Barossa, I think.
And it's a household name, right?
TWE is the company.
But Penfolds is the brand,
yeah,
right?
Penfolds is the brand.
Which
yeah.
I think, not only in Australia, but around the world is known as a high value export from Australia, shall we say.
Yeah.
Per litre, it's probably more valuable than most of those other things we've been doing.
Yeah, it probably is.
And we'll be going and talking with the proprietors or people involved in that project. What other projects can you give a bit of colour to and excite the audience with thinking about their tax dollars at work?
So maybe another good relatable household name is we funded a project with McCain. So McCain potato chips. If you've eaten them.
Sorry, I shouldn't. No commercial promotion. Whoops.
So McCain is basically looking to recover their excess heat and use that and optimize their heat usage at their Ballarat potato plant, our potato site. And so that's another example of an industrial transformation project where existing facility looking to do some interesting things to reduce their energy intensity emissions.
And that's a sort of highly replicable thing, I imagine. There's a lot of ag processing places in Australia that take a raw product like a potato and turn it into chips or whatever they turn it into. And there's a bit of heat involved in that, and they lose a lot in inefficient machines from the 20th century. And
pretty much
we're upgrading them with this project and can probably take the learnings and do it everywhere.
And that comes back to your question about the heat temperature zones that we talked about. So different sectors, different processes have different heat requirements, but then the solutions that are appropriate for a particular temperature zone then become replicable. So if you kind of solve the problem of, let's say, electrifying heat in the 40 to 60 degree temperature range, then other sites who also have that heat requirement could use that solution.
That's a great example of the value of having an agency like Arena sitting across all of these experiments and tests and innovations to cross-learn and see these synergies that happen and be able to take it from one temperature range into another.
And making that data, obviously not confidential data or IP public, but making that aggregated data public that says, this is what you get when you do the solution, and this is roughly how much it costs and what you need to think about. And so that's how we think about the taxpayer dollar going further than just one site.
Amazing. Well, maybe just to wrap and not to put you on the spot too much, are there any other examples of that sort of cross-learning or something that surprised you, like a learning that we've taken out of the industrial transformation stream to date?
Because it's a relatively newer fund, some of those projects are still kind of, getting going. We do have some examples looking at electric mining trucks and charging, which are reasonably progressed. So understanding how you can electrify, for example, like your underground mining trucks and how you charge them. So Blue Vein's doing that work, which is a pretty cool startup and pretty interesting work. Not specific to that industrial transformation stream, but maybe another good example of that kind of knowledge or, distribution of insights and learnings is we do have some existing projects in the alumina refining sector. And there's a working group that Arena's helped facilitate with all the alumina players that basically sits them down a round table and says, what are you battling with? Like, what's not working? How are you solving it? And then leveraging the different ideas, innovations, insights from those players to help push the overall sector together.
Sounds like an incredible job. Like, you're sort of taking your time at Bain & Company to bring diligence and thoughtful investment theses together, but also running multi-stakeholder roundtables with a bunch of industrials and partners on a given day. How does that look? Just paint a picture for Tanya's day in the life for the listeners.
Day in the life. So I'd say maybe the less exciting part is we run a cycle, an investment cycle, right? So ARENA's got the equivalent of an investment committee that basically sits once a month. So you're often in the cycle of, okay, what project do I have? What deal do I have that I want to see get over the line? What, diligence, blah, blah, all of that kind of stuff. And then it's going through this process. I can use this day. This day is actually not a norm. I have never done a podcast for ARENA, so let's call that an outlier. But you might, for example, meet with some prospective companies who are looking for funds. So I did that this morning. We were talking about decarbonising cement this morning. So we do quite a lot of those conversations. It's a pitch meeting, basically. Like, are we interested? What is the company doing? What do we think about it? Like, what's the pathway here? I do spend a decent amount of my time like actually then diligencing the projects, like getting my head around it, understanding it. What are our key questions?
ChatGPT, help me understand this.
ChatGPT, obviously. Rare earth separation, quickly ramp up. We don't use ChatGPT, we use in-house tech. Everything's confidential. So there's a lot of that, and there's a lot of prepping those materials like to take to our board, to our CEO. We spend a decent amount of time negotiating a contract once you make that decision. So I've got a few contracts sitting with me today. We're going back and forth on the T's and C's. We're deciding how are we going to pay out those funds? Like, what are the milestone points that would say, cool, we'll give you $2 million today and we'll give you $10 million in 3 months type of thing. That's like I wouldn't say it's repeatable. It's repeatable in terms of process, but obviously all the projects are different. But then I've also had the opportunity to do quite a lot of like conferences and speaking. Next week, I'm going to Perth for the week. We'll do a couple of site visits, which is really exciting. So I'll get to see our fast charging project on the ground and see what's been happening. We'll go have a look at electrolysis project that's part of our R&D portfolio. I'll speak at the WA Clean Energy Summit and then the Informa Green Metals Conference the next day. So yeah, that's a busy week. That doesn't happen every week.
No, it sounds like good work and must be time feeling well spent.
Yeah, I think so.
And just to wrap, you sound like you're in a family that's kind of committed, husband in the wind sector. You're doing all this amazing work around the country. How are you feeling? Is it a sense of winning in this decarbonisation agenda? So
maybe the frank answer is not every day. It doesn't feel like you're winning every day. It is hard. Like, and this portfolio particularly is in hard to abate sectors. It's more expensive. It's very expensive. You're talking about, big infrastructure projects and assets. So it moves slowly. So that side of things is sort of, you need to have patience. You need to see the long game, and slowly we'll move there. And I do think we are slowly moving there. I think the part of the story that makes me feel excited and more positive is it is undeniable that renewable energy power is cheaper today, cheaper than your alternatives, right? Whether that's coal or nuclear gas, whatever you want to bring to the table. But in a lot of instances, that is just undeniably cheaper. It's not a question of, is this the right thing to do? Is this what we should do because it's less emissions intensive? It's just the cheaper thing to do, which in a capitalist society is an excellent place to be. You want it to be cheaper. You don't want people to think about why they source electricity from X or Y provider. You just want them to source the cheapest electricity, and it's renewable. So that, I think, is really compelling. And we're starting to see grids operating at really high amounts of renewables. And, you got South Australia hitting really, really high percentages. So it's not a question anymore of, is this possible? Like, it's possible. We can do it. I think that's cool. And it's just a matter of getting enough supply and getting your grid infrastructure, your transmission, etc. in place. So that makes me feel optimistic.
Tanya, amazing work and fascinating go-round of Australia's opportunity space for people seeking to decarbonise industry of all kinds. What sort of money have we got to work with? Like, are we talking chump change, or can we really make a dent?
Yeah. How much do we have to play with? Well, let me explain it like this. ARENA has baseline funding. So we'd call that our, always ongoing open fund that supports our investment priorities. ARENA got a good amount of funding uptick in the last budget cycle. So I'd have to double check what it is today, but we have more than $1 billion in that fund overall.
$1,000 million.
$1 billion. Yeah. 1,000 million. Yeah. And, that's not just for this portfolio, it's for all of ARENA's portfolios, right? But then specifically in the portfolio that I work in, we also then have additional funds on top of that. So we've got Future Made in Australia Green Metals Specific Fund, which is looking at alumina, iron and steel decarbonisation. And that's a $750 million pot of funding, which is kind of recently open. We like to say it's not really changing what we do. We've always played in that space, but big upside, we've got more money to do that now, which is exciting. And then we spoke about the industrial transformation stream. That's another $400 million pot of funding to support industrial decarb. And we've committed about $150 million to date. There's some more in the pipeline. So there's probably $180 million left that's up for grabs. But yeah, long and the short of it is we do actually have enough funds to do some meaningful work in this space.
Yeah, that sounds like big time.
Yeah.
$1 billion worth of baseline, $750 million of green steel and stuff, and then a couple 150, 180 million for the industrial transformation stuff. Wow. Go get them.
Yeah. So it's a fun place to be.
Tanya, it's been great talking to you, and I want to do more of that because we haven't really even gotten into where you left us with the opportunity to make more stuff in Australia, particularly, for example, critical energy minerals, making the batteries and the photovoltaics and the things.
Mm-hmm.
But thank you so much, and see you next time.
Yeah, this has been great. Really appreciate it.
Well, Michael, thank you so much for joining us to discuss how decarbonisation can be done in all kinds of industries across Australia. We've just been talking with Tanya about the topic, particularly vis-a-vis heavy industry. But you're with the wine industry, one of Australia's important cultural and other exports. Can you tell us a little bit about you, kind of the name, rank, serial number first up?
Yeah, sure thing. Thanks for having me on. So I'm Michael Parks. I'm the Global Director of Sustainability at Treasury Wine Estates. What that means is I look after sort of sustainability topics right across the value chain for the business. So right from how we grow our grapes through to how we sell and package our wine.
And Treasury Wine Estates is a pretty big business from my knowledge of the wine industry, which is mostly as a punter, just enjoying the odd drink. But can you tell us a bit about the scale and scope of your responsibilities?
So Treasury Wine Estates is a proud Australian wine company with a genuinely global footprint, though. But what makes us really different, I guess, to most companies is that our heart is firmly in those regional communities. So places like the Barossa, the Clare, Coonawarra, and right across the country aren't just where we grow our grapes, they're where our people live, and where local economies depend on that thriving wine sector.
Tell me a little bit about the process of winemaking and where the decarbonisation requirement is, just for our listeners to understand.
Look, I guess just to talk through the value chain really briefly, vineyards are obviously where we grow our grapes, and there's largely diesel used out in those vineyards. It's, fairly remote regional settings where there might not be electrical options nearby. So a lot of it is diesel. From the vineyards, so those grapes are transported typically in trucks through to wineries. And that's where we sort, crush, and ferment, which is the process where grapes are turned into wine. And then we mature the wine. So for some of our products, this might just be for a couple of months. For others, it may be up to 5 years, even more, when you start to look at 50-year-old tawnies and things like that. So varying degrees of sort of carbon emissions there. And then of course, once we get into the packaging at our Barossa site, we typically just push the wine across into the packaging centre, and there it's very, very typical to a FMCG business. So package into bottles typically, but also do magnums and pouches and things like that there, as well as gift boxing, which is then obviously distributed to shops, restaurants, and direct to our consumers
all around the world. I'm enjoyed a few of your Coonawarras here in the United States, where I'm sitting right now. So I know you're a big business. Walk me through some of the sustainability initiatives that you, as Director of Sustainability, have led before we get to the ARENA project per se.
We are a listed business, and we've taken sustainability, very seriously. And so I've been with the business for just on 5 years now, and that's sort of a reset into how we thought about sustainability, and our commitment is obviously much broader than just climate or energy. And we've been, deliberately implementing our strategy over a couple of years now to sort of really improve our resilience. And that just is just acknowledging that the world is going to change. There's going to be shocks unforeseen. And just as a business, we need to improve our resilience to those. We need to foster healthy, inclusive communities. We're a business obviously steeped in selling products to people. So we need to not only reflect those communities, but understand some of the challenges, and of course promote moderation in consumption of our product. And finally, the thing that we're all here to do in the wine industry is just produce sustainable wine. And so that's really looking right across that value chain and making good choices in the way we do things and how we show up in markets to reduce our impacts, and sort of continue to sort of protect and preserve the earth from which we grow our beautiful products.
Speaking of resilience, I mean, at the time of recording, the world is reeling with a shock of a kind, which may not be the sort that some of your sustainability initiatives were first designed to address. They could be climate shocks from the weather changing, but same solution, I guess. If you've got a lot of diesel dependency in the fields and vineyards, then it might be good for the other kind of shock we've been experiencing with the fossil fuel supply chain so attenuated, and Australia being somewhere down the bottom of it. Is that the case, that the sustainability you speak of is sort of more broad scale than just climate per se?
Yeah, definitely. So, we focus in on things like water and packaging, health and safety, all those sorts of what we sort of call material topics here. We've got about 8 of those that we focus right on, and they're all sort of nested within those three pillars I spoke to earlier. And I mean, just an interesting point on these shocks. It's actually presents opportunities in some ways where you think about how it changes the business case. So, you roll back 3 or 4 years, we really started to reap the benefits in terms of accelerating the return on investment of a lot of solar that we'd done across the world, in terms of the shift in electricity prices there. And obviously with the war in Iran, we're starting to see things impact not so much electricity prices this time, but oil and gas, which will then obviously start to change the business case for how we look at some of the electrification projects in the field as well. So that's the thing; it's always pretty dynamic, and if you're not resilient to those changes, then I think as a business you're really going to suffer.
Great to hear, and good for your shareholders too, I'm sure. So talk to me a bit about the ARENA project. Where does it sit in your value chain, and what is it addressing?
The ARENA project is, centred really squarely on starting to address our Scope 1 emissions. Over the past few years, I mentioned earlier, we've sort of been rolling out solar. Well, we've sort of completed that phase of the journey, and we've gotten so far. So, if I sort of sum the numbers up, with electrification, a lot of work around energy efficiency and things like that, we're about 55% of our way through our journey to achieve net zero emissions by 2030 for our Scope 1 and 2.
Wow.
And so this ARENA project is really fast tracking us on our biggest site globally, which is located in the Barossa. The site, which involves, our largest winery, a packaging centre, as well as some surrounding vineyards, accounts for about half of our Australian Scope 1 emissions, with LPG being, the predominant source of those, along with a bit of diesel. And the ARENA project really is about trying to build a next generation winery precinct for us, one that's both low carbon and deeply circular. So when I spoke before about some of the other sustainability issues, I think it really comes to life in the Barossa. So the site there itself has, its recycling rate is already around about 98%. And through that, we've We've got very strong relationships with our key suppliers, with closed loop programs in place, which allows us to get to that sort of level. So we've done a lot of work there on changing the sort of resource flow. In addition, we capture sort of the treated wastewater and stormwater from that site and send it off to our vineyards, which in a water-stressed region like the Barossa is particularly important. And this project starts to take us even further in that circular journey and pushes us further down the chart in terms of we've got, as I mentioned earlier, a wastewater treatment plant on site. So we're currently capturing and flaring biogas. So we're going to capture that using our boilers essentially to offset that LPG use. And you can imagine that, that can operate a bit like a large battery where we can store some of that gas and use it when needed.
And again, be resilient to shocks. That sounds very good at this time.
Exactly. That energy independence is, a particularly attractive option in those regional communities where you're at the end of the line usually. And so what that, then allows us to do is to sort of electrify our hot water and thermal energy. So winemaking, uses a lot of hot water for cleaning, heating, and each of the process steps. I think there's lots of small batches going through different stages of fermentation and treatment. And so obviously looking at things like heat pumps and other electrification options there to replace, the fossil fuel-based heat that we're using at the moment. We're also sort of tinkering with things around the hot water settings and demand settings just to really optimize the efficiency there. And then sitting over the top, a lot of sub-metering and demand management, which will integrate with, all of the things that we've got on site. So over 3 meg of solar, we've got about 1 meg of storage coming online on site. And so the real trick is how you bring all that together and sort of start to decarbonise a relatively, light industrial operation that's grown over many years, as you can imagine. It's very much a retrofit and a brownfield site to all this on, so which is pretty complex as well.
I'm sure doing it all, while the plane is flying, as they say, rebuilding it, putting electric engines in is pretty interesting work, I'm sure. How big is the site? How many people work there, just to get a sense of the space in Barossa?
The site in the Barossa is about 38 hectares, so, 38 footy fields. We have about 550 people on site during vintage, which is what we're in the thick of right now. So working right across that winery and packaging operations pretty much 24/7 at the moment. It's a fairly substantial site.
This is great. So, I mean, we talked to Tanya a bit about how industry in Australia ranges from, dig and ship stuff in the Pilbara to all sorts of lighter industries that maybe our listeners don't think of always as industry. But you've got 500 people working in a big precinct, like you say, with a bunch of buildings, and there's boilers and there's processes and pasteurization and things going on with different temperature requirements and stuff. And you're saying, this project is allowing you to supplant some of that with a biogas you're building out of the waste stream. It's connecting you to electric heat pump technology and new tools and demand response, and making it all sort of a smart, all electric space to continue to grow great wines, but do it in a much more sustainable way. It sounds fascinating.
Yeah, and that's something that we're really excited about. As I think I said earlier, we live and grow in regional communities. And so this is really about that regional capability and jobs. And so as we sort of electrify and modernise sites like the Barossa, we're bringing those future skills into the region, which are critically important. We're also creating, plenty of opportunities for local contractors, engineers and trades, and just making sure that, regional manufacturing isn't left behind in this transition. And so the vision itself actually is for the Barossas to sort of start there, but it's effectively going to create a blueprint for us to roll out, across our business, but also across, the wine industry more broadly. So we're really excited about the potential for this to not only decarbonise, but revitalise and, bring just new things to the table that maybe people haven't considered yet.
Amazing. And you're willing to open source all the learnings and share that knowledge with folk around the world?
Yeah, 100%. The wine industry is a very connected one. We grow only about a third of the wine that goes into our products each year. So we've got growers and bulk wine partners that we're all very connected throughout. And so if we're to be successful, we need our partners in the industry to be successful. And it's projects like this that really sort of will lay out the blueprint, if you like, for how to decarbonise and what the benefits are. And so being a leader is being transparent and, bringing people along with you, and that's what we're really determined to do here.
Amen. Awesome. And, not just for the wine industry, Michael, I think that's an inspiration for all kinds of industries across Australia. Just to see a good old name like yours to deploy all this technology and make the moves and benefit from it from a financial point of view, as well as do the sustainability work. It's really impressive. And thank you for your time.
Yeah, most definitely. Thank you for having me.
That's it for this episode of ReWired. Thanks for listening and for being part of the conversation about how bold ideas become real change in Australia's clean energy future. We'll see you next time with more stories from Australians stepping into the arena and shaping what comes next. Until then, find out more about how ARENA is helping shift the dial on Australia's journey to net zero by following us on LinkedIn or visiting arena.gov.au.